In this lesson, we're going to learn about some of the uses of photometric lights within 3ds Max. Alright, so up until this point, we've been looking at just the standard light types that are available within 3ds Max. So we've looked at the target spot, the omni, and the direct lights. So what we're going to do for this lesson is change things up a little bit and take a look at how these differ from the photometric lights. Now, the photometric lights are actually meant to more closely mimic the way that light behaves in the real world. So you'll notice, as we add something like a target light, you'll notice that first, 3ds Max is going to ask us to add some kind of a logarithmic exposure control. Now, the reason is because these photometric lights, once we start to use these, are actually going to be rendering out high dynamic range images, right? A 32-bit image. Now, the monitors that we are using are not able to display that much color information, so we have to use this exposure control to bring that information down to a level where our monitors can actually display all the information that's there. So let's start with the target light. Let's say something maybe a little bit further over here. We'll drag this down. So again, the start of your click and drag will be the light, and then as you click and drag, you'll define the target. So let's take this light itself, and let's just move it over here. Alright, now if we take a look at some of the parameters of this photometric light, you'll notice that it looks very different from the standard lights that we've looked at up to this point. You'll see we really don't have any of the standard intensity controls or the intensity multipliers, which is really just an arbitrary number. Instead, these photometric lights actually rely on real-world luminance values. So either a lux or a candela or some kind of a luminance value, that is what's controlling the light intensity for this particular light. Alright, so let's just see what we get whenever we render this. Alright, so you'll see overall this is fairly bright, and that's due for two reasons. Number one, we have the intensity of the light itself, and then we actually have the exposure control, which is brightening this up quite a bit. Now, the exposure control can actually be found right over here. And you can see right now we're using the logarithmic exposure control, which Max already set for us automatically whenever we added this photometric light. So we actually have a few presets that we can use to kind of get ourselves started with these photometric lights. So we have the template that we can pull down. You can see we have a few pre-built already, so we can use something like a 100-watt bulb. Alright, and that will start to give us kind of this warmer type feel. Alright, and we can also start to adjust the actual temperature of that light, and this is referring to color temperature. So typically, a higher color temperature means you're going to start to drift closer to the blue end of the spectrum, and as you start to get to a much lower temperature, you'll start to get down into the red end of the spectrum. So normally, around 6500 is considered pretty close to pure white. 66,500 degrees Kelvin. Right, you can see that's pretty close to what we're getting now. So you're welcome to come in and adjust these any way you like, if you want to warm up your scene or cool it down a little bit. Alright, now we also have the actual intensity values of this. So if we need this light to be a little bit stronger, a little bit brighter, we can always start to increase the candela values of this. So right now it's at about 139 candelas. We start to intensify this and re-render, you'll notice now everything starts to brighten up. And you'll also notice that as we start to get to a much brighter color, you'll probably even notice a little bit of a color shift as well, and that's just all due to the light calculation of this light. So a higher intensity light normally is going to burn a little bit brighter and maybe have a little bit different temperature, which might affect the overall color. Right, now these lights are also meant to actually have a little bit of a fall off as well. So what we should see is if we were to bring our camera around and re-render from this angle, we should actually see it's very, very dark over on this side of the room. And that's, again, because these lights actually have real-world fall-off values built into them. So for that reason, it's actually very important to have your scene built to scale whenever you're going to use a photometric light. And in the case, I actually do have my scene modeled out to scale. Now, if you don't have this set up, you can do this by going to Customize and take a look inside the Units setup. Alright, now in my case I have this set to meters instead of just some random arbitrary value, which is what max is set up to by default. So right now, if you look at this little value right here, it says each grid unit is responsible for a little over a quarter of a meter. And if I go back, and if you look very closely at some of these different grid units, if you start to count these up, we have just a little over 8 of these different grid units. So I think it actually comes out to about 10 of these little grid units, and if you do the math, that comes out to a little over 2 meters, which is a little over 8 feet high from floor to ceiling, which is typical for a home. So we've got this modeled out pretty close to a real-world scale. Now, if we did want to get a little bit more light over into certain areas of this room, we do have the ability to override these intensity controls. So let's say, for example, we wanted this to be about 200 lux at 1 meter. And you can see that actual fall off that we have. Now, if we needed to, we could always raise this distance up a little bit higher, so that way it falls off over a much greater distance. And if I re-render this, now you can see that light is reaching a little bit further. Alright, so sometimes this can be a way of actually kind of dropping some of your intensity down without introducing a lot of unnecessary hot spots and bright spots. Although sometimes you can get those, but again, these do have a very high level of control to these. Alright, now one of the things that actually makes these photometric lights really nice is the fact that in addition to just having these basic presets, we actually can plug in real light data and have 3ds Max actually render this stuff out. So for example, let's take a look at the light distribution type. Right now this is set to a uniform spherical. We can also do something like a spotlight where it actually focuses this light into a certain area. But what we can also do is if I scroll back up here, let's set this to a photometric web. Now what this will do is give us the ability to actually plug in some kind of a real light source. So with this we can use something called an IES file, which is a light profile that can actually be created by a real light manufacturer. So in this case, this is just an arbitrary one that I found on the internet. Now I can't redistribute this because Digital Tutors does not own these files, but there are lots and lots of places that you can go online to find these IES light profiles. So once that's been loaded up, we can actually see the light distribution pattern for this, and we can actually see that shape actually kind of reflected here in the light itself. So now, if I render, based on this actual light that I had plugged in, we can actually get a totally unique light distribution pattern. Alright, so you can see that we don't have just a very simple, plain fall-off like whatever we had whenever we were using just a spotlight. We can actually sort of see the effect of lenses and things like that that would be in this real light source. So we can very quickly start to get these very realistic effects with these lights. So if I were to maybe just move this up against the wall a little bit closer and just bring this back and maybe get a little bit better light splash off of this. Alright, and there we go. So really the types of effects that you can get with these photometric lights are very, very diverse in that if you have an idea of some kind of a light manufacturer or some kind of an idea of what kind of a light distribution you want, chances are you can find some kind of a IES light profile that fits that particular pattern. So that's a look at the photometric lights within 3ds Max.